I didn't lose my job the day they ruined me at work. That happened later. What I lost first was something much quieter. Something no HR meeting could document. Something no apology could give back. My name. The way people said it differently when I wasn't in the room. The way conversations stopped when I walked in. The way my email replies suddenly came slower, colder, shorter. By the time I understood what was happening, the damage was already spreading. And the scariest part wasn't that they were lying about me. It was that they were doing it calmly, professionally, with smiles on their faces. This is the story of how they ruined me at work, and how I ruined them in front of everyone. I'm telling it now because silence almost destroyed me, and because someone listening right now might be standing exactly where I once stood, wondering how everything went wrong so fast. If you stay with me, you'll understand how reputations are quietly dismantled, how betrayal wears a friendly face, and why sometimes the only way to survive is to stop reacting and start watching. When I first joined the company, I wasn't special. I didn't have connections. I didn't have favors owed to me. I had one thing and one thing only: competence. I showed up early, stayed late, fixed problems that weren't assigned to me, and made my managers' lives easier without ever announcing it. Over time, people noticed. Or at least, I thought they did. I became the person new hires were told to shadow. The person asked to just take a look at projects falling apart. The one managers trusted to handle sensitive clients because I didn't panic and I didn't miss details. I liked that version of myself. I felt useful, secure, seen, and that's usually when it starts. The shift didn't come with a confrontation. It didn't come with a warning. It came disguised as something harmless. A meeting I wasn't invited to but found out about later. A project update where my contribution was summarized vaguely, while someone else's was praised specifically. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone has off weeks. Managers forget. Credit gets misplaced. But then it happened again and again. A co-worker I trained, someone I defended when she messed up early on, suddenly began speaking over me in meetings. She would repeat my ideas moments after I said them, phrased slightly differently, and receive nods and approval that never came my way. Another colleague, someone I considered a friend, started asking strange questions, not about the work, but about me, whether I was overwhelmed lately, whether I was still enjoying the role, whether I'd ever thought about exploring other options. At the time, I thought she was being kind. I didn't realize she was collecting material. The first time my manager pulled me aside, I genuinely thought it was for praise. We had just wrapped a complicated deliverable ahead of schedule. I was proud of it. Instead, he closed the door and sighed like I was already exhausting him. He said there had been some concerns. He couldn't name who raised them. He couldn't show examples. Just vague phrases. Communication issues. Tone. Collaboration. I remember nodding politely while my chest tightened. I asked for specifics. He smiled and said it wasn't anything major, just something to be aware of. That word, aware. From that day on, everything I did felt like it was being watched through a distorted lens. If I asked questions, I was being defensive. If I stayed quiet, I was disengaged. If I pushed back, I was difficult. If I complied, I lacked initiative. There was no winning, only shrinking. The lies didn't sound like lies at first. They sounded like interpretations, opinions, feelings, and that's what made them so dangerous. One afternoon, I overheard my name in the break room. It wasn't loud enough to hear every word, but I heard the tone. Concerned, disappointed, certain. I walked away before they noticed me, my coffee untouched in my hand, my reflection staring back at me from the hallway glass like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. That night, I went home and replayed everything. Every email, every meeting, every moment I'd brushed off as insignificant. Patterns began to form, slow and sickening. The same 3 names kept appearing at the center of it all. The co-worker I trained, the friend who asked too many questions, and my direct supervisor, They weren't shouting lies. They were whispering them, repeating them just often enough, just consistently enough, that soon they didn't sound like rumors anymore. They sounded like facts. My performance review that year was unrecognizable. Language like inconsistent and needs improvement replaced words like reliable and strong contributor. When I asked for examples, I was told it was a general pattern and that we'd monitor it going forward. HR got involved quietly, not because I complained, because someone else had. Sitting across from that neutral-faced representative, I felt like I was defending a stranger. I listened as concerns were summarized in polished corporate language that stripped them of their cruelty while preserving their impact. When I spoke, I could hear the tremor in my own voice. Not because I was guilty, but because I was confused. How do you prove something didn't happen when the accusation is about who you are, not what you did? I left that meeting knowing something had shifted permanently. People stopped including me in conversations I used to lead. Decisions were made without my input, then explained to me after the fact. I was copied last on emails, if at all. My suggestions were met with polite silence. The worst part wasn't the isolation. It was the gaslighting. When I tried to address it, I was told I was imagining things, that I seemed stressed, that maybe I was projecting insecurities, that everyone was just busy. I started questioning myself, wondering if I had missed social cues, if my tone really was wrong, if I had somehow become the problem without realizing it. Then came the meeting that changed everything. It was a team presentation to upper management, a project I had practically lived inside for months. I knew every metric, every risk, every workaround. I had written most of the documentation myself. As the slides advanced, my coworker stood at the front of the room presenting the work as if it were hers, not just summarizing it, owning it, speaking confidently about decisions I had made, solutions I had designed. I waited for acknowledgement, a nod, a mention, anything. It never came. Then, casually, she mentioned a misstep early in the project, a delay, a decision that caused some friction. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. All eyes turned toward me. No one defended me. Not my supervisor. Not the friend who knew the truth. Not the colleagues who had watched me fix that very problem. I sat there, heart pounding, face burning, and realized something in that moment that changed the way I saw everything. They weren't going to stop. And if I reacted emotionally, if I protested loudly, if I demanded fairness, it would only confirm the story they were already telling about me. So I did the only thing they didn't expect. I stayed quiet. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped trying to correct the narrative in real time. I nodded in meetings. I accepted feedback calmly. I thanked people for bringing concerns to my attention. Inside, something hardened. Because silence, I learned, makes people careless. And carelessness creates evidence. From that point on, I started paying attention differently. I saved emails instead of deleting them. I documented timelines. I noted inconsistencies. I compared versions of documents. I kept track of who said what and when. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I didn't warn. I let them continue. They grew bolder, sloppier. They contradicted themselves in writing, took credit publicly while blaming privately, forgot which version of the story they'd told to whom. Every time they thought they were burying me deeper, they were actually handing me another piece of proof. I knew exactly what they thought of me by then. Weak, cornered, on my way out. What they didn't know was that I had stopped trying to survive the moment and started preparing for the end. And that end was going to happen in front of everyone. Once I stopped trying to defend myself, everything changed. Not on the outside. On the outside, I became exactly what they wanted me to be. Quiet, agreeable, easy to manage. I took notes instead of arguing. I thanked people for feedback instead of challenging it. I started every sentence with phrases that made me sound uncertain even when I wasn't. And they loved it. My supervisor started relaxing around me. Meetings that used to feel tense became casual again. but not because they respected me, because they thought I was done. I could see it in the way he interrupted me without apology, in the way he explained things I already knew as if I were new or slow. The coworker who took credit for my work stopped being careful. She forwarded emails that clearly showed my original drafts attached underneath her edits. She spoke too freely in chat messages, venting about cleaning up my work while accidentally timestamping the exact moment she had copied it. The friend who betrayed me started slipping too. She contradicted herself, depending on who she was talking to. She reassured me privately while criticizing me publicly. She forgot which lies she'd already told. I wrote everything down. Dates, times, witnesses, screenshots, document histories, not obsessively, methodically. What surprised me most was how easy it became once I removed emotion from the process. When I stopped hoping they'd change, stopped wishing someone would step in, stopped waiting for fairness to appear on its own, I could see the situation clearly for the first time. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. They had decided I was expendable. And once someone decides that, the truth becomes optional. Weeks passed, then months. My reputation stayed damaged but stable. I wasn't fired. I wasn't promoted. I existed in this uncomfortable middle space where I was useful enough to keep but diminished enough to ignore. And that worked in my favor, because people talk around you when they think you're harmless. I learned more in those months than I ever had before, about how decisions were made, about who actually held power, about how often people justified cruelty by calling it professional judgment. I also learned something about myself. I learned that patience can be sharper than anger. There were nights I went home shaking with rage. Nights I replayed conversations in my head and imagined standing up in meetings, exposing everything, watching their faces crumble in real time. But I didn't, because I knew timing mattered more than truth. The opportunity came disguised as good news. A company-wide restructuring, leadership changes, a renewed focus on transparency and accountability. Those words were repeated so often they almost lost meaning. There would be presentations, cross-team reviews, senior executives sitting in rooms they'd never stepped into before, HR presence for alignment. My supervisor announced that our team would be showcasing a major project, the same one that had been quietly stripped of my name months earlier. He spoke with confidence, outlining roles, assigning speakers. When he mentioned my name, it was in passing. Support role, backup, available for questions if needed. I nodded and smiled. Inside, everything clicked into place. This was it. The room, the audience, the paper trail. I checked my files that night. Everything was there, organized, chronological, undeniable. But still I waited, because exposure only works when people aren't prepared for it. In the weeks leading up to the presentation, the pressure intensified. My coworker became more defensive, more controlling. She corrected me sharply in front of others. She rewrote parts of the project without telling me, then blamed me when inconsistencies appeared. I apologized. Every time. Each apology made her bolder. My supervisor stopped including me in prep meetings entirely. Decisions were finalized without my input, then delegated to me for execution. I documented that too. The friend avoided eye contact now. She kept conversations shallow, professional. I could tell she was nervous. People who lie consistently always are. The night before the presentation, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of what would happen, but because I was afraid of what wouldn't. I knew once I crossed this line, there was no undoing it. No returning to just doing my job. No pretending we were all professionals navigating misunderstandings. This would burn bridges. But some bridges are built to trap you on the wrong side. The morning of the presentation, I dressed carefully. Nothing dramatic. Nothing memorable. Neutral colors. Calm posture. The version of me they expected. The conference room filled slowly. senior leaders, HR representatives, managers I had only seen in email signatures, people who had never known my name, only the version of it passed along quietly through meetings I wasn't in. I took my seat near the back, laptop closed, notebook open. My coworker stood at the front, confident, rehearsed. She spoke about challenges, successes, lessons learned. She referenced the team often, but specific credit landed everywhere except where it belonged. When she mentioned early issues, she framed them as missteps that had to be corrected. Again, no name. Again, everyone knew. My supervisor nodded along, occasionally adding commentary that reinforced her version of events. I waited. Then came the Q&A. A senior leader asked a question about a timeline discrepancy. My coworker hesitated, then answered vaguely. Another leader followed up, asking who had approved a particular decision. My supervisor answered that one incorrectly. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. I raised my hand. The room turned toward me, surprised. I hadn't spoken publicly in months. I kept my voice even. I said I could clarify if helpful. Permission was granted without much thought. I connected my laptop. No accusations. No emotional language. Just facts. I walked through the timeline calmly, displaying email approvals with timestamps, document histories showing original authorship, meeting invites that included me, excluded others. I didn't say they lied. I let the contradictions speak for themselves. Questions followed, polite at first, then sharper. Why did the documentation show revisions made after approvals? Why were concerns raised months later being attributed to early stages? Why did internal messages contradict external narratives? Faces changed. My coworker tried to explain, then stumbled, then deferred to my supervisor, who suddenly seemed less confident than he had minutes before. HR began taking notes. I showed one final email, a forwarded thread where credit was reassigned, accompanied by commentary that directly contradicted what had just been presented. The room went quiet. I closed my laptop and sat back down. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the meeting moved on, not because it was resolved, but because there was nothing left to say in public. After that day, everything unraveled quickly. Private meetings replaced open ones. Calendars filled with closed-door conversations. People avoided me in hallways, not with disdain, but with uncertainty. Investigations were launched quietly. Roles were reviewed. Processes scrutinized. I was called into HR again, but this time the tone was different. They asked me when I had noticed discrepancies, how long I had been documenting, whether I had raised concerns before. I answered honestly. I said I had tried, that I had been told it was perception, stress, misunderstanding, that I stopped pushing when it became clear doing so would only make things worse. They nodded. Apologies came next. Awkward ones, carefully worded ones that focused more on process improvements than accountability. My coworker stopped coming to work shortly after. Officially, she was exploring other opportunities. My supervisor was reassigned. The announcement framed it as a leadership realignment. The friend sent me a long message late one night. She said she never meant for things to go this far, that she was under pressure, that she thought staying quiet was the safest option. I didn't reply, because silence, I had learned, says everything. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel proud. I felt tired. Vindication doesn't restore what suspicion destroys. It doesn't rewind months of doubt or erase the way people looked at you when they thought you were the problem. But it does something else. It gives you your name back. And that mattered more than I realized. After everything came out, people expected me to feel relieved. They said things like, "At least the truth is out now," and "I'm glad they finally saw what was really happening." A few even congratulated me in that quiet, uncomfortable way people do when they don't know whether celebration is appropriate. But relief wasn't what settled in. What I felt was a strange emptiness, as if I had been holding my breath for so long that when I finally exhaled, my body forgot how to inhale again. Work didn't return to normal. It never does after something like that. The office felt different, but not safer. If anything, people were more cautious. Conversations were more guarded. Smiles felt rehearsed. Everyone knew now how easily a narrative could be shaped, how quietly someone could be pushed to the edge without anyone stepping in. I became something else in their eyes. Not a victim, not a hero, a reminder. And reminders make people uneasy. Leadership scheduled meetings with me to discuss future growth. They asked where I saw myself in the company. They talked about opportunities, visibility, rebuilding trust. I listened politely. Inside, I was already drifting away. Because once you've seen how the machine works, it's hard to believe it will protect you next time. The truth is, even though I had exposed them, even though the facts were undeniable, the cost didn't disappear. It just shifted. People stopped underestimating me, but they also stopped confiding in me. I was no longer someone they casually vented to or speculated around. I was someone who documented, someone who remembered, someone who didn't forget. And that kind of reputation carries its own isolation. I started noticing how often my name came up in conversations I wasn't part of. Not in criticism anymore, but in caution. I overheard someone say, half joking, "Careful what you say around her." I wasn't angry about it, just aware. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent months being silenced, dismissed, talked over. Now, my presence alone made people choose their words more carefully. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and once it does, everything around it changes shape. The friend who betrayed me eventually transferred departments. She never apologized in person. Her message stayed unanswered, and over time, the space between us became permanent. I didn't hate her. I just couldn't trust her. And without trust, there's nothing left to repair. What haunted me more were the moments when I wondered if I had gone too far, not in exposing the truth. That part was necessary, but in waiting. There were days I replayed those early moments in my head. The first meeting, the first misattributed credit, the first time I felt that subtle shift in how people looked at me. If I had spoken up then, loudly, persistently, would it have changed anything? Or would it have accelerated my downfall? I would never know. What I did know was this: the system didn't reward honesty. It rewarded documentation. And that realization stayed with me long after the dust settled. Months passed. The company moved on, as companies always do. New priorities replaced old scandals. New faces filled empty desks. Processes were updated. Lessons were learned. On paper, everything improved. But something inside me remained unsettled. I had won, by every measurable standard. My name was cleared, my record corrected. The people who hurt me were gone or diminished. Yet when I sat at my desk, I no longer felt proud of the work the way I once had. I no longer believed excellence alone could protect you. I saw the invisible currents now, the alliances, the quiet power plays, the way truth bent depending on who was speaking and who was listening. And I wondered how many other people had been ruined quietly, without evidence, without timing, without the opportunity to defend themselves. That thought followed me home at night. Eventually, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I resigned, not in anger, not in protest, calmly, professionally. When my manager asked why, I told the truth. I said I needed distance, perspective, a place where I could work without constantly measuring my words, my tone, my presence. He nodded, understanding more than he said. My last day was quiet. A few people wished me well. A few avoided me altogether. No speeches, no grand closure. As I packed my things, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I was leaving, but because I was choosing myself again. I didn't leave broken. I left informed. and that distinction mattered. Time passed. Life expanded beyond office walls. New work, new environments, new people who didn't know my history, who took me at face value. Still, the experience stayed with me. I became more observant, more intentional, slower to trust, but quicker to recognize patterns. I no longer dismissed discomfort as insecurity. I treated it as information. And when people asked why I was so careful, I didn't tell them this story. Not because I was ashamed, but because not everyone needs to know how close you came to being erased. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see back then. They didn't ruin me because I was weak. They targeted me because I was competent, because I didn't play politics, because I assumed good intentions in a system that thrived on ambiguity. And I ruined them in front of everyone, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. There's a difference. Revenge seeks pain. Survival seeks truth. But even knowing that, I still ask myself the hard questions. Was it right to wait? Was public exposure the only option? Did I protect myself? Or did I become something colder in the process? I don't have simple answers. What I do have is clarity. If you are ever in a place where your name is being quietly dismantled, where whispers replace facts, where you feel yourself shrinking to fit a narrative you didn't create, know this. You're not imagining it, and you're not powerless. But power requires patience, and patience requires strength most people don't talk about. I tell this story now because someone listening might be at the beginning of that process, still confused, still trying to fix things politely, still hoping fairness will show up on its own. I want you to understand what I learned the hard way. Silence can be a shield, documentation can be a weapon, and timing can decide everything. What you choose to do with that knowledge, that part is up to you. There's a version of this story that people like better. It's the version where everything ends the moment the truth comes out, where justice feels clean and immediate, where the person who was wronged gets their life back exactly as it was, just with an apology attached. That version doesn't exist. What comes after exposure is quieter, heavier, and far more complicated. In the months after I left, I realized how deeply the experience had rewired me. At first, it showed up in small ways. I reread emails before sending them, searching for hidden interpretations. I hesitated before speaking in meetings, weighing how my words could be reframed later. I noticed who stayed silent when someone was misrepresented and who benefited from that silence. I had learned the language of damage too well. In new workplaces, people told me I was calm under pressure, observant, thoughtful. They said I didn't rush to judgment, that I listened. What they didn't see was the constant evaluation running in the background, the quiet cataloging, the instinct to prepare, even when there was no immediate threat. Trauma doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like vigilance. I thought distance would dull the memory, and in some ways it did. The faces blurred, the voices softened, but the lessons stayed sharp. I learned how fragile reputation really is, how it can be shaped without ever touching facts, how easily concern can become condemnation when repeated by the right people. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I learned that I was capable of waiting, of withholding reaction, of letting people destroy themselves with their own confidence. That knowledge both empowered me and unsettled me, because once you realize you can do that, you start wondering where the line is. There were moments I replayed the presentation in my head, the shift in the room, the quiet panic, the realization spreading across faces that something was very wrong. I asked myself whether I enjoyed it. The honest answer was no. What I felt wasn't pleasure. It was gravity, like watching something heavy finally fall after being suspended too long. But still, the question lingered. If someone hurts you quietly, is it wrong to respond loudly? If someone rewrites your story, do you owe them a private correction? Or does public damage deserve public truth? People like simple morals, clear heroes and villains. But real life doesn't work that way. My coworker wasn't a monster. She was ambitious and insecure and afraid of being overlooked. My supervisor wasn't evil. He was conflict avoidant and willing to sacrifice one person to maintain peace. My friend wasn't malicious. She was weak when strength was required. Understanding that didn't excuse what they did, but it complicated how I felt about what I did in return. I sometimes imagine an alternate version of myself, one who confronted them early, who refused to be sidelined, who escalated loudly and immediately. I wonder if she would have survived. Maybe she would have been labeled emotional, aggressive, difficult. Maybe she would have burned out faster, without evidence, without support. Or maybe she would have forced a reckoning sooner and spared herself months of quiet erosion. I don't know. What I do know is that the version of me who waited wasn't weak. She was strategic, and strategy isn't always comfortable to sit with afterward. There's a reason people admire patience from a distance, but struggle with it up close. Waiting means watching harm happen without intervening right away. It means trusting a future version of yourself to handle what the present version cannot. That's a heavy thing to carry. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the people who watched what happened to me and said nothing. The colleagues who sensed something was wrong but chose safety over solidarity. I don't blame them the way I once did. Fear makes cowards of good people, and organizations are very good at teaching fear without ever naming it. If this story has a villain, it isn't just the individuals involved. It's the environment that allowed quiet destruction to feel normal, the system that rewarded ambiguity and punished clarity. The truth is, I didn't beat them because I was smarter or stronger. I beat them because they underestimated how long someone could endure while collecting proof. That's not a lesson I'm proud of, but it's one I respect. Now, when people ask me for advice about workplace conflict, I hesitate, because the advice that sounds good isn't always the advice that works. Speak up sounds brave. Document everything sounds paranoid. Trust your instincts sounds vague, but put together, they tell a different story. Speak up when you can. Document when you must. Trust your instincts when something feels off. And above all, don't let anyone convince you that your perception isn't valid simply because it makes them uncomfortable. I didn't ruin them because I wanted revenge. I ruined them because they left me no other way to exist truthfully in that space. That distinction matters to me, because revenge seeks satisfaction. What I sought was restoration of my name, my work, my reality. Even now, I don't celebrate what happened. I don't tell the story to feel powerful. I tell it because silence protects the wrong people more often than it protects the right ones. And because somewhere someone is being quietly erased and doesn't yet know it. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Pay attention to patterns, not apologies. Watch who benefits when you're discredited. And don't confuse professionalism with passivity. You are allowed to protect yourself. But how you do that is a choice only you can make. I chose to wait. I chose to expose. I chose to walk away afterward. Would I make the same choices again? I think about that more often than I expected. Because every victory changes you. And not always in ways you anticipate. I don't regret what I did, but I respect the cost. There's a moment that comes after every quiet war. It doesn't arrive with applause or consequences or closure emails from HR. It arrives when the noise finally dies down and you're left alone with yourself, wondering who you became in order to survive. That moment found me long after the office doors closed behind me for the last time. I was sitting at my kitchen table one evening, laptop open, reviewing work for a completely different company, a completely different life. No tension in my chest, no dread before meetings, no second-guessing every word I typed. And still, I paused before hitting send. That's when I realized something important. Even though I had escaped the situation, part of it had followed me. Not as fear, not as anger, but as awareness. I knew now how quickly things could turn, how easily a reputation could be bent by repetition instead of truth. how silence could be weaponized by the wrong people and reclaimed by the right ones. And I asked myself the question I had been avoiding since the beginning. If I had the chance to go back, would I do it the same way? The answer didn't come immediately, because the truth is, there are two versions of strength, and I lived both of them. The first version is the one everyone praises. Speaking up early, drawing boundaries loudly, refusing to be disrespected. That strength is visible, clean, easy to admire. The second version is quieter. It waits. It observes. It absorbs pressure without breaking. It documents instead of reacting. It chooses timing over impulse. That strength is uncomfortable, often misunderstood, sometimes judged. That was the strength I used. And it saved me, but it also changed me. I no longer believe that workplaces are neutral spaces. I don't assume good intentions without evidence. I don't confuse friendliness with loyalty or professionalism with protection. That doesn't make me bitter. It makes me precise. There's a difference. I also no longer believe that walking away is always the high road. Sometimes walking away lets the story harden without you. Sometimes it allows lies to calcify into truth, simply because no one challenged them. And yet, I don't believe revenge should be the goal either. What I did wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about watching people fall. It wasn't about proving I was smarter. It was about stopping the damage. They ruined me at work slowly, quietly, in ways that could have followed me for years if I hadn't intervened. And when the moment came, I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I showed the truth, in front of everyone. And the truth did exactly what it needed to do. Nothing more. Nothing less. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. You are not weak for staying silent when you're gathering information. You are not paranoid for documenting patterns. And you are not cruel for choosing the moment that protects you best. But there's another truth, too. Living in constant vigilance is exhausting. Carrying proof instead of peace takes a toll. Waiting for the right moment means enduring the wrong ones longer than most people could. That's the part no one talks about. So here's where I leave you. Not with a lesson, not with a warning, but with a choice. Because every person who hears this story will feel pulled in one of two directions. And I want to know which one you believe in. Side one believes I did what I had to do. That silence was survival. That waiting was strategy. That public exposure was justified because the damage was public, even if it happened quietly. That if someone is destroying your name behind closed doors, you don't owe them a private correction. Side 2 believes I should have walked away sooner. That no job is worth this level of psychological warfare. That staying meant letting the situation define me longer than it deserved to. That peace is more powerful than proof. And sometimes the real victory is leaving without explaining yourself. Both sides have merit. Both sides come with consequences. And both sides say something about how you believe power should be used. So now I ask you, if someone was quietly dismantling your reputation at work, if they were smiling while doing it, if speaking up early would have made things worse, would you wait, collect proof, and expose the truth when it mattered most? Or would you walk away, protect your peace, and let the story go unfinished? Tell me which side you're on. And more importantly, tell me why. Because these stories don't end when the job does. They end when we decide what kind of strength we believe in